Now, deep belly fat is really inflammatory. What we realized is that deep belly fat produces all sorts of inflammatory markers, interleukin 6 and tumor necrosis factors. So it actually results in increased inflammation in the body. And it is associated with increased insulin resistance. And that high level of insulin and the high level of inflammation, those two things, and I'm sure there's more, are really drivers for all of these processes to get out of whack in the body, for the cholesterol to get out of whack, for your inflammation in your arteries to get out of whack, for cancer to like to grow. And so
inflammation drives all these
that
things,
deep
right?
fat that's absolutely. And so, and that deep fat is not just hanging out. It is metabolically active, as we've talked about before. And if you always like to talk about, it's metabolically active. It's not just sort of sitting there. It's really doing
not just
a
holding
lot.
up your pants.
It's an endocrine organ. It's doing no, right? It's actually doing things. It's producing all these chemicals and hormones, and it's increasing the inflammation in your body. And so if there's one thing that people can focus on, like if you're, you kind of, sometimes people get overwhelmed with all these messages in health, right? Like, oh my goodness, what do I do? What diet do I follow? What should I work on? Where do I focus? And sometimes people get overwhelmed and they almost give up. We see that all the time. And this is like the basic thing that everybody can focus on. Even for myself, like I'm like, I do a lot of these self-care things, right? I try to all the time, right? But this is an area that we can all focus on that can improve our health if we just pay attention to what's our waist circumference and what's our waist to hip ratio, because that's telling us how much belly fat we have.
Yeah, so I think that's right. I often joke and say there's a simple test you can do to figure out if you have this problem. It's called the mirror test. You take off your shirt, you look in the mirror, you jump up and down. And if your stomach jiggles, you probably have it. And the truth is 88% of Americans have it. Are metabolically unhealthy. That's because they have this visceral fat.
Absolutely.
It's making them unhealthy and causing all these other problems that we see as separate, right? Oh, I have high blood pressure. Oh, I have high cholesterol. Oh, I have high blood sugar. But they're all the same problem. Yeah. Or I have low sex drive or low testosterone, or I have, pimples and poor periods and sleep apnea and whatever the things are that we're suffering from. We see them as all separate, but they're all connected by this. And with COVID now, the vulnerability of this population with visceral fat is just been highlighted. 63% of hospitalizations could have been prevented if people had better metabolic health and ate better food. So the real question is, one, we're going to talk to them about what causes it and how we start to diagnose it. But what are the ways we can diagnose it properly? You mentioned the waist to hip ratio. That's a simple test. Tell us about that. And then let's talk about some of the blood tests that you see that may seem like other stuff, but are clues to you having bigger belly fat.
Yeah, the waist to hip ratio is a great measurement that we can all do and repeat on our own. So what you do is you get your waist circumference, and to find the right place for your waist circumference, it's in between, you find your lowest rib and you find your upper hip bone, and then you put the tape measure in between, and that's considered your waist circumference. So if you find that your last rib and your hip bone and go in between the two, that's considered your waist circumference.
It's like your belly button,
and then your
pretty
hip
much, right?
circumference. Yeah, some people's belly button hangs down or is in a different place, so it's not always the belly button, but it is around that area. Yeah, and then their hip circumference is it's considered over the greater trochanter. But if you don't know where that is, I always say to people, go over the largest part of your hip, because that just makes your number look better. So you want to get the biggest hip circumference as you can have. Not that you want to be way overweight, but you pick the biggest hip circumference to determine your waist hip ratio if you can't figure out where that greater trochanter is.
Yeah.
So for the goal for Caucasians is to have a waist circumference less than 35 inches for women and less than 40 inches for men. For Asian and Indian ethnicities, it's stricter, less than 31 inches for women and less than 37 inches for men. And that waist to hip ratio is a great measurement to do. So for women, you want to be less than 0.8. And for men, less than 0.9 is the waist hip ratio you want to have. So you want, a smaller waist than hip, of course. And the neat thing, this is a really simple test you can do and something you can check every month. You can redo your waist hip ratio every month and watch your progress and say, okay, what am I doing? What do I need to do? And it's a really inexpensive way to figure out, is this a problem for me?
Yeah, that's really huge. And I think it's also important what you said, in that people who of Indian or Asian descent can have significant visceral fat and all the complications from it at much lower weights. So they may, if you look at their weight might be perfect. It might be less than 25, 23 in their body mass index, which 25 or more is overweight, but they may be full of this visceral fat, and they can be diabetic, they can be thin, and they look thin. We'll call them skinny fat. So they have the same issues as someone who is overweight, but they're just over fat.
Yes, or TOFI, right? Thin on the outside, fat on the inside. So if you are a smaller person, then that's where also that waist to hip ratio can be really helpful. And you're right. No test is ever perfect. For some people, the waist circumference or the waist to hip ratio isn't giving us all of the information. There's a lot of other biomarkers that, of course, tell us that somebody has too much visceral adiposity, that somebody is carrying too much weight around the belly. If we see a high C-reactive protein or marker for inflammation, it makes us wonder, okay, do they have metabolic syndrome, insulin resistance, visceral adiposity? If we see that fasting insulin greater than 5, that's when we say, okay, this is something we have to pay attention to. If we see too many small, dense LDL cholesterol particles, we've spoken about that before, that's a sign that somebody has insulin resistance or visceral adiposity. If we see, we also check for things like oxidative stress, too many free radicals being produced, that's a sign. If their liver function tests are high or they have signs of fatty liver, that can also be because of this visceral adiposity. Or gout, high uric acid, that can also be because of this, or that pattern in cholesterol, the high triglycerides, low HDL. All of these things can give us a sign, give us information and say, okay, this person is struggling with metabolic syndrome, insulin resistance, or probably because of visceral adiposity.
And you often notice all these things abnormal at the same time, right? So you see a pattern, and it's really pretty easy to diagnose when you know what to look for. So you get inflammation, you get abnormal cholesterol, and you get high blood sugar, high insulin, lots of oxidative stress, your liver. I mean, these are all things that seemingly are treated like separate problems, but they're all connected to this visceral fat.
And what's amazing is to watch them improve when we make shifts or changes in somebody's lifestyle, there's lots of things that can contribute to this, from toxins in the environment to shifts in the microbiome to poor diet, having a nutrient poor diet. Eating too many refined and carbohydrates and simple sugars, not getting enough exercise, poor sleep, too much stress can all contribute to it. But when we shift somebody's lifestyle and when we make shifts in these issues that they're dealing with, we see these markers, these biomarkers improve significantly. So it's really fun to watch. We see it improve all the time.
So I'm going to get into, the causes a little more deeply in a minute, but there is another test that we often do, which I like a lot, and it's sort of the gold standard. It's called the DEXA body composition test. And it's like a X-ray, a very low dose X-ray. I mean, you have to basically take 50 of these to equal one flight across the country from New York to California in terms of radiation. And it measures the compartments of your body, your arms, your legs, your belly, and can tell you what the fat is, where it is. And it's pretty compelling. There's also MRI technology that does this, CT technology, liver fat measurements. So there's a lot of ways to look at this, but it is really the central problem of our time. And there are many causes, but the major cause is our ultra processed high starch sugar diet. That's the biggest cause, because that drives insulin, and insulin drives all the available fuel that you've eaten into your fat cells in your belly. And then it keeps the fat there, prevents this breakdown process called lipolysis of your fat, and it produces all these inflammatory compounds, and it screws up your hormones, and it makes you hungry all the time, and it slows your metabolism. So it's the worst possible thing. And it's really driven predominantly by that. So we know that a high carbohydrate, in the sense of starch and sugar diet, because vegetables are carbohydrates, so you can eat as much of those as you want, is the biggest driver of this.